Hello again. I want to talk today about a man who's probably had more influence on modern Britain than anybody else, whose ideas pervade practically every aspect of what we're talking about these days when it comes to asylum seekers, immigration, the police being institutionally racist, about diversity and inclusion at universities and in the higher echelons of business, about all sorts of things. I doubt if one viewer in 1,000 will even have heard of this man, though. We are so preoccupied with ideas of ethnicity and race and hunting out prejudice while ensuring equality that perhaps we don't stop to think that one man really came up with the whole idea that different ethnicities are absolutely equally endowed with intellectual ability and everything else. This modern craze was a result of one man's work, and his name was Franz Boas. Franz Boas was born in Prussia, which is now part of Germany, in 1858. His parents were Jewish, although not religiously observant. He began his academic career studying physics and geography, and then became interested in anthropology, which was at that time a fairly new discipline. After embarking upon a field trip to study the waters of the Arctic, Boas instead became fascinated by the Inuit people of Canada. A few years later, still in his 20s, he emigrated to the United States, in which country he spent the rest of his life. He is today known by some as the father of American anthropology. His thinking has been enormously influential on ideas relating to race. He was, for instance, a mentor of, among others, Margaret Mead. I'm sure some readers have heard of Coming of Age in Samoa. In the early years of the 20th century, the traditional Victorian beliefs about scientific racism still held sway. It was thought that there was a strict hierarchy of both races and the cultures which they produced, with the Anglo-Saxons at the pinnacle of racial, intellectual, scientific, cultural and technological development. Franz Boas thought this a short-sighted and parochial perspective. He promoted instead the notion of cultural relativism, suggesting that there was no objective way of judging between different societies and cultures, and that all such opinions were subjective. Who's to say that the British, with their technologically advanced civilization, were actually a more worthy culture than that of the Aboriginal inhabitants of Australia? Such ideas may have been groundbreaking and revolutionary in the 1920s, but they are, of course, now the orthodox and accepted view of most educated people in the West. This led, almost as a matter of course, to the revolutionary thought that if this was the case with societies and cultures, could it also be true of the individuals who made up those populations? If the Inuit culture, or that of the Kalahari Bushmen, was in no way inferior to that of Britain or Germany, then why should we think that the men and women in those African or Canadian groups were somehow inferior intellectually or in any other way to, say, the British royal family? Perhaps cultural differences are all. Boas showed that the then popular ideas about the world's races being distinct and separate, with particular physical features associated with each of them, was mistaken. He did this by analysing some of the studies about things like skull size and proportion, and showed that they were little better than the old pseudoscience of phrenology. As far as it went, Boas' work was perfectly correct, and the way in which he dismantled the ideas relating to race, which had been riding high for a century or more, was masterful. He worked with the black sociologist and historian W.E.B. Du Bois, and with him was involved with founding the National Association for Coloured People in 1909. Boas worked too with the researcher and inventor Booker T. Washington, who was also black. There's no doubt he was quite indifferent to the colour of a man's skin. One of his students was Ruth Benedict, who went on to enjoy a distinguished academic career herself, and was able to advocate for cultural relativism from within Columbia University. She wrote a book in 1934 called Patterns of Culture, which made her one of the most well-known anthropologists to hold such views. She also co-authored a book called The Races of Mankind, which set out to demonstrate that all differences between people are entirely a result of environment, and that there is nothing at all about them which suggests any inherent differences. So, for example, she mentions a case that an American raised in China would speak Chinese, and feels that that somehow disproves the idea that there could be any inherent intellectual difference between Chinese people and those from Europe. There's a great deal in the writings of Ruth Benedict, who was really the apostle or disciple of Franz Boas, which has now been either proved to be incorrect or at the very least called into question. But the point has been made that the modern progressive view of race was already firmly established almost a century ago in the United States, and it spread out from there. The ideology devised by academics like Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict is still going strong today. It's gone from strength to the point at which challenging or even asking too many questions about the subject has the effect these days of making people appear to be racist. Many writers today simply repeat the assertions made by anthropologists like Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict in the 1930s, as though this is enough to prove their case. So they will say things such as, race is a social construct, or anthropological research can be used to show that biologically speaking, race is a myth. All these things are actually bare assertions. There's little evidence to support them. They are bare assertions, in effect simply quoting Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict. But because of the way things are now, with the absolute mortal fear people have of being accused of racial prejudice, nobody likes to draw attention to this. Practically all the ideology that we see now relating to things such as efforts to get more black people into Oxford University, the idea that no Oscar can be awarded unless there are black people involved in the production or starring as in major roles in the film. It's all a product of Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict's ideology. Franz Boas is almost certainly the most influential thinker whose ideas hold sway in Britain today, and nobody's even heard of him.